It's now fashionable to say that America is racist. That is a lie. America is not a racist country.
Growing up in the Deep South, I've seen racism up close. I know what it is, and it isn't Donald Trump.
Our family went from cotton to Congress in one lifetime. And that's why I believe the next American century can be better than the last.
That was not a Saturday Night Live sketch. Welcome back to AM Joy. I'm Tiffany Cross. If you watched the Republican National Convention last week, you'd almost think that the Republican Party is the one welcoming people of color, given the big display of diversity. The convention featured more than a dozen African-American speakers alone. But don't be fooled that the party of Trump has suddenly warmed to the same people Trump's policies and sometimes his rhetoric directly harms. As friend of the show, Elie Mystal, wrote so eloquently in The Nation, the Republicans invited a cadre of professional black friends to validate Donald Trump and make white people feel a little less racist while still very much supporting white supremacy. Also, let's keep in mind that their message of inclusion was completely contradicted by the McCloskeys. You remember them, the St. Louis couple who was charged with a felony when they brandished assault rifles at peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters. Now, they sounded more like the Trump-era Republicans we've all come to know.
What you saw happen to us could just as easily happen to any of you who are watching from quiet neighborhoods around our country.
It seems as if the Democrats no longer view the government's job as protecting honest citizens from criminals, but rather protecting criminals from honest citizens.
Despite this perpetual framing of people of color as a threat to America, a recent Pew Research poll found that while Trump still has very low support among voters of color, the Latinx support for Trump is at 35%, 7 points above the 28% he got in 2016. So can the GOP strategy be effective? Joining me now to talk about it is Aaron Haynes, editor-at-large for the 19th and an MSNBC contributor. My friend and nemesis, Dr. Jason Johnson, political contributor for The Griot and MSNBC, and the great pollster Fernand Amandi and host of the podcast Strange Days, and of course my pal Kurt Bardella, senior advisor for the Lincoln Project and also an MSNBC contributor. Thank you guys for joining me. Jason, I'm going to start with you first. I mean, I watched the Republican convention, and seeing the slew of black speakers that they had, it really did look like a modern-day minstrel show to me. What did you make of it?
Well, there was a tremendous amount of diversity from the sunken place during the RNC. So we have to remember how important it is that they found that whole slew of black folks. Look, this is the thing, Tiffany. You were very correct when you put this out at the beginning. None of these people have any credibility with the black community. None of these people can erase the stain of the president's own racist rhetoric. None of what he was saying made sense. It wasn't just the McCloskeys. They said nothing about Rittenhouse. They said nothing about white nationalists and terrorists. And you literally had somebody up there trying to explain the president saying there were terrible people on both sides. None of what was done at the Republican National Committee was actually for black people. It was for racist white people who are already going to vote for them and to give them a sense that they can feel slightly less racist. But let's be honest, if you were going to vote for Trump, you didn't have a problem with bigotry to begin with.
Right. So I want to turn to you, Fernand, on this one, because the thing that strikes me is the growing support in the Latinx community. As a Democratic pollster, I'm keenly interested in your perspective on this. I've often said that polling minority communities is sometimes its own science because you'll get a different response depending on who's asking the questions. What do you make of this increased Latinx support, particularly being based in a battleground state like Florida?
Well, Tiffany, I mean, I think it speaks to what we know is a concerted effort by the Trump campaign to try and move the numbers on the margins, especially in states like Florida, where they know that they can possibly carry those 29 electoral votes by just shifting the Hispanic vote there by a mere 3 or 4 or 5 percentage points. But, you know, one of the things I think it's important to acknowledge as well, this election really is not a question of whether or not, Tiffany, people of color are going to turn out or support Donald Trump. As the polling that you indicated in the graphic earlier made very clear, we have almost 90% of black voters that are going to support the Democratic ticket, 2/3 of Asian and Latino voters also as well. We need to acknowledge what this election really is. It's about the white voter electorate and the understanding and the recognition that this election is not really a choice about Republicans versus Democrats. It's not even a choice really about Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. As we saw so clearly in the conventions last week, the difference between the Democratic convention and the Republican convention, which I think would have made Lenny Reichenstahl proud with the propagandistic gaslighting elements we saw on display. This is a choice between good and evil. And the question is, will white voters in this country, especially those white male voters, which is the only group that over the last 30 years has consistently voted in majority for Republicans, will they look in the mirror and choose the path of white supremacy, choose the path of racism? I got to tell you, I'm concerned because in the first slew of post-convention polls that we've seen, they say that the election is actually tightening and that Joe Biden's double-digit lead has now become a single-digit lead. And in politics, the trend is everything. So I think we need to think about it in those terms. Will white voters, not voters of color, will white voters do what is right to save this nation and the soul of this nation by voting against Trumpism and the evil of Trumpism?
Well, I think that's the perfect time to bring in my buddy, Kurt Bardella, with the Lincoln Project, because a lot of your advertising, well, that's my good friend, Latasha Brown, who's the co-founder of Black Voters Matter. We had some technical difficulties, so Latasha Brown is now a part of the conversation. But I want to go to first Kurt Bardella. I'll get back to you, Latasha. Kurt, I want to talk to you because the Lincoln Project really is laser focused on white voters, right? I mean, they focus on Republican voters who are overwhelmingly white. Will white voters be swayed by some of the ads the Lincoln Project has put out there and not vote against their own interests and vote for somebody who is clearly perpetuating systems of white supremacy?
I'd like to think so. That's why we're doing what we're doing, Tiffany. I think that one of the things to remember here, too, is not to overreact to polls right after these moments that we just had with the conventions, because the reality is most people still haven't really fully checked in yet. We've always seen traditionally that happens after Labor Day, that everyone's expected to get a little bit of bump from their respective sides after a convention, after 4 nights of exposure like what we've seen over the last 2 weeks. But the reality is in this country is that every single person here is still grappling with things like the coronavirus and the economy. People are still worried about sending their kids to school. They're still worried about whether they can get a job, keep their job, and make a living wage to pay their bills. And I think that when you look at what the Lincoln Project's been doing, it's a constant reminder for those white voters, those disaffected Republicans, people who aren't sure about Trump, independent, suburban white people, that there is a horrible track record here from Donald Trump. Donald Trump is no longer a theory. It's not a, well, maybe we'll vote for this guy because who knows what will happen. He can't be any worse than what we've had before. That was the attitude of so many people who voted for him over Hillary Clinton in 2016. Well, that mystery's gone. We know what a Donald Trump presidency looks like. We know what kind of carnage that wreaks on the American people. We know what 170,000 plus lives lost looks like now, and how every single person in this country is somehow touched by that massive loss of life, and yet there's still no plan forward. It's not getting any better. From the convention that we just saw from Donald Trump, you wouldn't even know that coronavirus was still a pandemic ravaging communities every day. They act like that it's done, that it's mission accomplished, and that they've solved it. But that's just so detached from the working reality that people are facing every day. And that's why in all these polls, it's still Joe Biden who has higher trust barometers. It's still Joe Biden that people trust to deal with the coronavirus more. And frankly, Donald Trump's own approval rating, we just saw in a new poll released today by ABC News, his approval rating still can't get above 35% no matter what he does. So I think that tells us, as we've talked about, the convention wasn't about expanding the tent. It wasn't about growing their vote. It wasn't about getting more black people to vote for them. It was about trying to assuage the guilt of white people to make it somewhat palatable and okay to vote for a vote racist. And I just don't think that's going to work.
Well, we will see. I've often said that, Kurt, you're one of the smartest analysts on television, and obviously one of the most curious is that beautiful book you have sitting behind you, my friend. So thank you. Appreciate that. I want to turn to you,
This is
Aaron.
why I'm your friend and not a nemesis like Jason Johnson.
Exactly. I'll drag Jason later on Twitter, so we'll get to that. Thank you. I want to turn to you, Aaron, because you actually have some news to share about the outreach from the Biden campaign to communities of color.
Yeah, Tiffany, it's Sunday, which means that the MTV VMA Awards are tonight, and the Biden campaign is up with a new 60-second ad that they're going to debut during the VMAs. So here it is.
There have been several protests in Tallahassee, just like there have been several protests across the country. These protests are not just about police brutality anymore. They're about addressing systemic racism and economic disparities across our country. And I think electing Joe Biden is essential to addressing these issues and getting meaningful change. Black lives should more than just matter. We should have the same abilities to live our everyday lives just as much as anyone else has. My dad took me to my first protest when I was 12 years old. It opened my eyes into what activism looks like, what democracy should look like. I felt it was my obligation as a student, as a leader, as a Black woman, to be involved in these protests. We have to continue the activism. We have to continue protesting. But we also have to go out and vote.
Wow, so that's my first time seeing the ad. Thank you for debuting it here with us, Aaron. That was actually Alan Williams, former state legislator in the state of Florida, featured prominently in that ad. Aaron, how impactful do you think these types of political ads will be with the American body politic, given the state of what's happening in the country today?
Well, you know, I think that this ad is definitely intentional and signals a few things. One, that the Biden campaign understands that they're going to need to shore up young voters who tend to lean Democratic, but who don't always turn out in the numbers that older voters tend to turn out in. And this is really kind of the biggest push headed into the general election that the Biden campaign has made for young voters thus far. But it's certainly kind of in line with a pattern that we've seen recently. You saw, for example, Steph Curry and his family in the DNC convention lineup talking about the importance of voting and their support for Joe Biden. You saw Joe Biden having a conversation with Cardi B that went viral earlier this month. And so this is, you know, definitely a key demographic that he and Senator Harris are planning to reach out to. It'll be interesting to see kind of what additional surrogates they roll out to galvanize young voters who tend to kind of tune in as the closer that we get to election. We've seen polling that suggests that young voters are very enthusiastic and interested in this election, that they are looking to maybe turn their protest activity of this summer into political action, but they are also unsure about how they can do that fully and safely in the middle of a pandemic. And so voter education is going to be a key piece of this as well. And I think you'll probably see the campaign doing that. But galvanizing this demographic with an election that, as others have mentioned, will likely be won on the margins is going to be key to the coalition that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to need for victory in November.
Coalition building, that's key. All right, finally we get to LaTosha Brown. We had some technical difficulties off the top, but the amazing singer and founder of Black Voters Matter is now officially with us. LaTosha, I want to ask you, because watching some of these Black people speak, and even I'll include Nikki Haley in this, the former governor, Republican governor of South Carolina, who says, you know, the country's not racist, and then the next breath talks about how her parents experienced discrimination in America. It's like, do they not even hear what they're saying? How do you think that this will play out with Black voters? And I just want to make the point that the people who speak here are Black faces, not Black voices. These are Black faces who the MAGA crowd is comfortable with, not Black voices who are steeped in the community in any kind of way.
Absolutely. You know, when you look at what Trump has done with the Trump party, I would say that it is a classic, the Southern strategy, revisited. It is the Southern strategy, play by play. Even when you go back to Nixon and Goldwater, there was always, quote, a token person of color or Black person to say, oh, look how well the Republican Party has done for me, right? And so that's one in terms of disconnecting from collective, how Trump and his policies have impacted the collective. When we see that 80% of Black small businesses did not get any support in the PPE in the stimulus package, when it is projected that 50% of Black businesses will actually go under in this space. When you look at the raw numbers, he has not done well for the Black community at all. And so there's always been an attempt to divide and conquer, to actually bring voices that are not representative, not rooted in community, and are not really representative to the whole truth around what is happening in our community. What I find in this space, when we're talking about the Southern strategy, the way that being a daughter and a native of Alabama, I can tell you that the dog whistles, how do you fight that and how do you beat that? One, I think we have to really be focused, and I think the Biden-Harris campaign being focused and leaning into the possibility of not just saying, can we sway white voters, but really solidifying their support with voters of color and Black voters so that there is a high performance of those voters that we know are going to align with the strategy and their agenda. The second thing is we have to know the dog whistles when we hear the dog whistles. And instead of giving a whole lot of time to those one or two people who are really simply distractions, we have to really go into what is the agenda that we want to move forward. Those are some of the ways I think we can address what we saw with the RNC. It was all performative.
Yeah, I asked the director of the Diversity Coalition the specifics about their outreach, Bruce Lavelle, right here on this show, and we were never able to get any real answers from him, unfortunately. So, Dr. Johnson, because you're in for an epic dragging later on Twitter, I'll turn back to you and ask you, what is the deal with this trickery? So, Lynn Patton, who's the Trump party planner turned HUD official, tricked these Black people, Black tenants in a New York housing authority into appearing in this video. And of course, they come out later and say, well, we are not Trump supporters. We had no idea we were going to be in this video. So it's not necessarily a real outreach to Black voters, but a part of their operation is very much encouraging Black people to stay home and not vote. How concerned are you that that strategy might depress some of the numbers across the country? Given COVID-19 and the fallout, given the state of the economy, people feel like it doesn't matter who's in office, my life has stayed the same. What do you say about that?
Tiff, yeah, that is a concern of mine. And here's the thing. It's not just the people from housing. It's the people who had the naturalization ceremony. It's Ann Dorn speaking for her husband, who was not a Trump supporter. Like, they couldn't find enough Black people to like Trump, so they had to trick Black people into pretending that they like Trump, only to be exposed about it later, which it's important that people like you are actually bringing to the fore. Look, we have to remember, this was not a convention to bring people to the Republican Party, okay? It wasn't red meat to his base. It was something that they had to do because they had 4 nights of airtime they had to fulfill. All Trump and the Republicans are doing is trying to consolidate power. They do not care about your vote. They want to make sure as few Black, brown, and white people who they don't like. Remember, they just sued 2 counties in Iowa to stop them from sending absentee ballots. Iowa. So they don't even want white people to vote. We have to remember that this is not an election between good and evil. I mean, not to go against somebody. It's not good and evil. It's between fascism and a dictatorship and the remnants of democracy that we still have. If we do not vote Donald Trump out, if Black people don't vote, if white people don't vote, we won't have another free election for another 20 years. That is not hyperbole. And that's what we have to remember. No matter what he tries to do, we still have to vote like our lives depend on it, because this time they do.
Yeah, that's a really good point you made. It's not even just about depressing voters of color outreach. He's depressing the white vote. So I thank you for making that point.
Yes.
I think we should finish this conversation over brunch and mimosas at some point, because now we're out of time. This is a great conversation. So thank you, guys. Thank you, Aaron Haynes, for debuting that ad. Thank you, Dr. Jason Johnson, Latasha Brown, Fernanda Mondi, and the amazing Kurt Bardella. Coming up,